All eyes were on her, and Katie felt constricted in her tight wedding dress. She started feeling breathless as her face started to color. She took as deep a breath as possible and looked down at her handwritten words. She scanned the faces of those seated, and her eyes landed on one woman in particular. She looked at her husband's ex as she spoke, vividly remembering what her fiancé had confessed to her. One date was etched into Katie Hill's mind. It was the day she had met Jeremy, and it was the day that her life had changed forever. The two had hit it off spectacularly, and even though they had just met, Katie felt her head spinning with the giddiness of new love. She was blissfully unaware of the bombshell that Jeremy would drop on her. Katie and Jeremy had a whirlwind romance, and he seemed perfect in every way. Katie felt like she was living a fairy tale. Every time her phone pinged, her stomach would flutter in hopes that the message was from him. And if it wasn't, her heart would plummet. You see, Jeremy was quite a catch. Katie would soon find out that other women knew it too. All Katie could fixate upon was Jeremy. When they were together, she replayed every minute of their time together, carefully storing away every last detail. The way his lower eyelashes rested on his cheek while he checked his phone, the scent he wore, like walnut wood and honey. It wasn't long before Jeremy proposed, and Katie was over the moon. But soon, her full heart would be shattered into pieces. Katie licked her wounds and wondered how she had gotten to this point. She had been plucked from the dizzying height of her love for Jeremy, and then had fallen to one of the worst lows of her life. She lay on her bed, and the despair engulfed her like a blanket. She had her phone in her hand, and on the screen the devastating message stared at her contemptuously. When Jeremy's message made its way to Katie's phone, she was writing her vows. Hearing the notification, she had rushed to read it. She reread the words carefully, and then suddenly it felt like her heart had been ripped from her chest. The message was a late-night confession from Jeremy, and he had been hiding something from her for the entire time that they had been together. And in just a few hours was the day of their wedding. Would Katie go through with the wedding now that she knew what kind of man her fiancé really was? The wedding was paid for in full. There would be no way of ever getting the money back. But by the time she'd made her mind up, it was too late. She was scheduled to walk down the aisle, but all she wanted to do was curl up into a ball and cry. She couldn't go through with the ceremony, or could she? Everything was already all set up for the big day. By the time caterers were already serving food and all the guests had arrived, Katie had no idea what to do. The texts kept swirling in her mind. Anxiety about whether she was doing the right thing overwhelmed her. Then, she felt an unexpected wave of calmness wash over her. She knew what she was going to do. She knew what Jeremy had done during the early period of their relationship, but try as she might, she couldn't forget it and let it go. Now on the day of the wedding, Katie decided to do the only thing she could think of. She had decided to go ahead with the nuptials as expected, but she had an ace up her sleeve. So she got dressed in her beautiful white gown, picked up her bouquet of flowers, and made her way down the aisle. Katie's closest friends and loved ones were seated, happiness radiating from their faces as they waited to share the bride's big moment with her. Jeremy's mother and father couldn't have looked prouder when they saw their son standing at the altar, beaming down at them. None of them noticed Katie's tear-stained face and stony expression, but when they realized what she was doing, it was too late. As her fiancé looked at her, puzzled, his face fell as he saw hers. He knew immediately that she was not an ecstatic bride-to-be, but he had no idea what was coming. As the time came for them to say their vows and their I do's, Katie waited for Jeremy to finish before she went wildly off-script. She pointed out Jeremy's ex and asked her to stand. So what had Jeremy confessed that had set all this in motion? Jeremy had revealed to Katie that he had a child. When she had asked him how old the child was, he had replied that he had been born on April 28th. The date hit Katie like a sledgehammer as she tried to grasp what Jeremy was trying to tell her. Surely there was some sort of mistake. Katie was appalled that her husband-to-be would keep such a big secret from her. When she asked who the mother of his child was, she recognized the name instantly. She checked the wedding guest list, and sure enough, her name was there. Now that she knew, there was no going back. Then, Katie suddenly stopped herself from crying. She knew what she had to do. The date on which Jeremy's secret son, Landon, had been born was just 11 days after they had met. Katie's heart filled with anger and disappointment. Jeremy had lied to her for the entire duration of their relationship. Why hadn't he told her? And what else was he keeping from her? Could she trust anything he had ever said? But it was only at their wedding that Katie decided to speak up. Katie started to recite her vows, and the onlookers were mesmerized by her words. She looked pointedly at Jeremy's ex, Casey, and began to speak. Then, she addressed Landon. But her speech wasn't anything like anybody had expected. After a moment of uncertainty, another wave of surprise went through the crowd as everyone fell silent. "First, I want to thank you for accepting me as your friend and allowing me to be a part of Landon's life," Katie read, her voice breaking. Casey was so moved by Katie's heartfelt words that her eyes started to fill. Then Katie kneeled in front of Landon and continued her speech. When Katie had heard about Casey, she had been filled with resentment. But as time went on, she softened. In a gesture of maturity and compassion, she decided to include the two in her vows. She started to reach out to Casey, and the two formed an unusual bond. She even grew to love Landon as if he were her own. Katie had decided to write a special piece in her vows to include Casey and Landon in her wedding ceremony. "I promise to be an amazing mother to your son," she said. "I will guide, teach and love him every single day. I promise to respect, work, listen, and communicate together as co-parents," she continued. "I will love you guys no matter what comes our way. We are one family always." The guests were in complete awe. Katie then turned to her stepson, who was standing there by her mother's side. "Landon, I love you more than you will ever know," Katie said. Then she paused and wiped a tear away. Then she added something more that filled everyone with emotion. "I'm so happy that I now officially get to be your bonus mommy." Katie had written and rewritten her vows until they were perfect. "I knew I was missing something," Katie told Global News. "I was missing what made mine and my husband's relationship work." Speaking of her husband's ex and child, "I wanted to include them, but I never knew how," she explained. "I wanted people to see how important they were to me." There wasn't a dry eye at the ceremony, and Katie's amazing message about co-parenting quickly went viral. The video of her heartfelt vows has since garnered over 2,000 views, and strikes a chord with many. "This was absolutely beautiful," one woman wrote on Facebook. "Kudos to this wonderful and special family, and as for the bride, she's one of a kind. It felt like nobody was in the room," Katie says. "I practiced so much so I wouldn't cry. I didn't even hear anyone cry. It was just a bittersweet moment. All four of you are so amazing. This is absolutely inspiring, and I wish everyone involved in co-parenting situations matures enough to follow your example," another Facebook user wrote. "I wasn't just going into a marriage with Jeremy and needed his trust and respect, but I needed Casey's and Tyler's too," Katie explained to the media. "One thing I promised was to be one family always. I know without hesitation we will never break that promise," she also said. However, things would be more difficult than she expected. But things didn't always go so smoothly between the two women. The one thing we had in common, though, was Landon. "Landon was and is the beat to our hearts," Katie says. "The little guy who not only changed our routines and norms, but he changed us," Katie explained. But would that be enough to make sure the unconventional family got along well? So many stories, rumors, and judgment, but what would you expect? That's all we ever saw. That's the norm. You don't like the other person, she said. Katie has shown that she has come a long way in 4 years and was able to embrace her stepson and, more surprisingly, her husband's ex as an important part of her family.